Evenings in Florida were always known for their beauty and calm, yet near Carter's farmland, that calmness often turned into something heavy and sinister. The reason was the old cemetery that rested right beside his fields. During the day, it appeared like any other forgotten place, but when night fell, the air around it carried a strange, chilling weight. The trees that surrounded it would sway violently in the wind, and their rustling leaves created a sound that was eerily similar to a woman's cry. For years the villagers had spoken of it, whispering that the cries did not belong to the wind, but to something far darker. They said the place was haunted by the spirit of a woman, a witch who had never left her grave. Carter was a stubborn farmer, a man hardened by years of working the soil. The land was his life, and he cared for it more than anything else. He would often work late into the night, even when the village around him sank into silence. People had warned him countless times to stay away from the cemetery after dusk, but Carter laughed at their warnings. To him, these were nothing but stories, superstitions meant to frighten children. Yet somewhere deep inside, he too carried an uneasy feeling that perhaps there was more truth in those stories than he wanted to admit. One night Carter was busy planting seeds. The moon was half hidden behind moving clouds, and the silence of the night was broken only by the sound of his shovel striking the earth. Suddenly, he froze. A sound drifted to his ears, faint but unmistakable. It was the sound of someone crying. At first he tried to ignore it, telling himself it must be an animal, but the sound grew louder, clearer, more human. His grip on the shovel tightened, his hands trembled. Slowly he turned his eyes toward the cemetery. In the darkness, beneath one of the crooked old trees, a figure stood. A woman. Her frame was tall, her long white dress glowing faintly under the pale moonlight, and her hair whipped wildly in the wind. Carter blinked hard, and for a moment she was gone. But when he opened his eyes again, she was standing there once more. This time the sound of weeping poured out from her, echoing through the night as if she were mourning at her own grave. Carter's legs felt rooted to the ground. He could not move, could not breathe. Terror gripped his chest like a fist. In sudden panic, he dropped his tool and ran as fast as his body would allow, his boots kicking up dirt as he stumbled toward his farmhouse. That night he did not sleep. Every time he glanced toward the window, he felt as though the pale figure was still there among the trees, watching him silently. The next morning the entire village was in an uproar. A family living near Carter's land told everyone that all through the night someone had knocked on their door. Each time they opened it, they found nothing. Yet a woman's scream echoed again and again outside their house. The children cried in fear, and the women recited prayers until their voices cracked. Everyone knew it could only be the spirit, the same restless witch whose presence had been felt for decades. Carter said nothing, but the image of the woman would not leave his mind. Her eyes haunted him most of all. They glowed like burning coals, staring deep into his soul. He could not shake the memory no matter how hard he tried. Finally, he decided he had to face the truth. If he wanted peace, he would have to uncover the secret of that cursed ground himself. Days later, he gathered his courage and walked through the cemetery gates. The graves were old and broken, some toppled over, others half swallowed by weeds. A stench of damp earth filled the air, heavy and suffocating. The trees overhead groaned and swayed, their leaves rustling with that same mournful sound. Every step Carter took seemed louder than the last, his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Suddenly he felt it, a hand on his shoulder. His entire body went cold. He spun around, but there was no one there. Then he saw it. One grave in particular stood out. The soil above it was disturbed, as though something inside had been clawing its way out. Carter's knees nearly buckled. The cold wind pressed against his skin, seeping into his bones. For the first time in his life, Carter admitted to himself that the stories were not just tales. Something evil was indeed tied to this place. From that night onward, the village grew more restless. Families locked their doors earlier, lamps were extinguished before the moon was high, and the silence of fear filled every home. Yet still the witch came. Some swore they saw her shadow near their windows. Others claimed they heard fingernails scraping against the wood of their doors. They screamed, but no one was ever there when they looked. For Carter, it was worse. Night after night, he saw her near his fields. Once she even stepped beyond the cemetery and stood in the middle of his crops. He forced himself to approach, his breath shaking. But when he drew close, she released a shriek so loud it shattered the silence. Carter fell to the ground, ears ringing, body trembling uncontrollably. When he woke, the sun was already rising, and he lay alone in the field. That was the night Carter changed. He no longer doubted the existence of the spirit. He no longer laughed at the stories. The witch was real, and she was tormenting them all. Now only one question remained: how could she be stopped? Carter's nights became unbearable. He could no longer sleep without waking to the sound of crying drifting across his fields. Sometimes it was a soft, sorrowful weeping, and other times it was a scream so piercing it made his blood run cold. The villagers had begun to avoid his farm altogether. They whispered that the witch had chosen him, that he had somehow angered her, and that anyone near him would suffer the same fate. Carter, however, was not a man who surrendered easily. He knew fear was spreading like fire through the community, and if no one acted, the witch would continue tormenting them forever. Still, his heart was heavy. Each time he stepped outside at night, he felt her presence lingering. Sometimes he caught glimpses of her in the shadows of the trees, her long arms reaching as though to pull him into darkness. Sometimes he heard her voice whispering his name in the wind. So close it felt like her lips were pressed against his ear. One evening, determined to confront whatever haunted his land, Carter armed himself with a lantern and his heavy shovel. He stepped into the cemetery, his breath visible in the cold night air, his eyes searching the rows of crooked headstones. The moonlight shone weakly through a veil of mist, turning every stone, every tree, into the shape of something monstrous. The silence shattered when a crow screamed from above, flapping its wings violently before vanishing into the night. Carter tightened his grip on the shovel. He told himself that this land belonged to the living, not to spirits, not to witches. If she wanted to frighten him, she had chosen the wrong man, but deep down, he felt her. She was near. Suddenly a sound came from the far end of the cemetery, a low, dragging noise, like fingernails scraping across stone. Carter lifted his lantern and followed. The air grew colder with each step, so cold his fingers stiffened and his teeth began to chatter. Then he saw her. She stood before the disturbed grave, her back to him. Her long black hair spilled across her shoulders, swaying unnaturally in the still air. Her dress, torn and filthy, clung to her bony frame. Slowly she turned, and Carter's lantern light fell upon her face. Her eyes glowed red. Her mouth twisted into a scream that echoed across the fields. Carter staggered back, clutching the shovel like a weapon. But instead of vanishing as a ghost might, she moved toward him, floating across the ground without a sound. Every step she took felt like the earth itself recoiled, the grass withering beneath her feet. With a roar of defiance, Carter swung his shovel, the metal slicing through the misty air. But his strike meant nothing. She was behind him in an instant, her cold breath brushing his neck. He spun again, but she was gone. The lantern flickered, its light growing weaker, and shadows swelled around him. The witch's voice filled the air, whispering, mocking. "You cannot bury what is already dead, Carter. You cannot silence me." Sweat poured down his face, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. But Carter refused to run. Instead, he dropped to his knees before the open grave. His mind raced. The stories, the old villagers had said the witch's soul was restless because her burial had been incomplete, her sins never punished. That was why she roamed the nights, searching for peace that would never come. Carter dug. His shovel tore into the soil with furious strength. The witch shrieked, a sound so loud it rattled his bones, but still he dug. The earth gave way, the grave widening with each strike. Suddenly the shovel struck something solid. Carter brushed away the dirt with trembling hands until the rotten wood of a coffin emerged. The stench was unbearable, a foul mixture of death and decay that burned his throat. The coffin lid cracked, and Carter forced it open. Inside lay a twisted skeletal body. Its eye sockets were hollow, its jaw frozen in a scream that mirrored the cries Carter had heard each night. Shreds of fabric clung to its bones, the remnants of the same white dress the witch wore. The air grew heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The witch materialized again, now towering over him. Her face twisted with rage, her claws stretching toward him. "Leave me, or I will take your soul." Carter's body trembled, but his spirit did not break. He shouted over her screams, raising his shovel high. "You will never haunt this land again." With every ounce of strength, he drove the shovel into the coffin, breaking through the bones beneath. The witch let out a scream so horrific it split the night, a cry that carried across the fields, through the village, into every ear and every heart. Windows shattered, animals wailed, and the ground shook. But Carter did not stop. He struck again and again, until the skeleton crumbled into dust. Then, silence. The mist lifted. The air grew warm again. The glow in the witch's eyes flickered and faded, her body dissolving into smoke that drifted upward and vanished among the stars. For the first time in decades, the cemetery stood still, silent, at peace. Carter fell to his knees, gasping, drenched in sweat. He knew it was not over. The witch was gone, but only for now. Something told him she would try to return. If he had learned anything tonight, it was that evil never died easily. The days following Carter's terrifying battle with the witch brought an eerie calm to the village. For the first time in years, families could sleep without waking to screams in the night. Children played in the fields again, and no one heard the dreadful knocking at their doors. The villagers whispered in awe about Carter, calling him brave, some even calling him a savior. Yet Carter himself did not feel like a hero. Deep inside, he knew what he had done in the cemetery was not the end, but only the beginning. At night, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear her voice. Sometimes faint, sometimes sharp like a blade against glass. It was as though a piece of her still lingered, not gone, merely buried deeper. He would wake drenched in sweat, convinced that if he stepped outside, he would find her shadow waiting for him beneath the old trees. One evening, Carter sat on his porch, staring out at the cemetery. The sunset painted the sky in shades of blood red and gold. The graves looked peaceful, almost ordinary. But as the light faded, the unease returned. He could feel the weight of the land pressing against him. The earth itself seemed to hold secrets, and the silence was too deep, too unnatural. That night, a storm rolled across the farmland. Lightning split the sky, thunder roared, and the rain fell hard against the earth. Carter could not sleep. Each strike of lightning illuminated the cemetery outside his window. At first, it appeared empty. But then, during one flash, he saw her. A figure standing among the graves, motionless, staring directly at him. His blood turned to ice. He blinked, and she was gone, but the feeling of dread remained. The storm grew worse, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. Carter knew he could not stay inside. If the witch had returned, he had to face her once more. He grabbed his lantern and shovel, the same weapons he had carried before, and stepped into the raging night. The cemetery gates groaned as he pushed them open. The storm beat down upon him, rain blinding his eyes, but he pressed forward. His boots sank into the wet soil as he approached the grave he had disturbed before. The earth above it had sunk lower, the hole darker and deeper than before. It was as if the ground itself had opened to swallow him whole. A sound rose from within the grave. At first, it was a low moan, like the voice of the dead carried by the storm. Then it grew louder, shriller, until it became the same scream he had heard that night when he shattered her coffin. Carter staggered back, his lantern shaking in his hand. Suddenly, she erupted from the earth. The witch, her body made of shadows and bones, her eyes burning brighter than ever. Her scream pierced through the storm, drowning out the thunder. She rose higher, her form stretching unnaturally tall, her arms like twisted branches reaching for him. Carter roared, raising his shovel again, but before he could strike, she vanished into the storm. Her voice swirled around him, laughing, mocking. "You cannot bury fear, Carter. Fear will always rise again." Lightning split the sky, and for a moment, Carter saw her face inches from his own, pale, rotted, yet grinning wide. He swung with all his strength, but the shovel passed through empty air. He stumbled, falling to his knees in the mud. The storm raged on, and her laughter echoed from every direction. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm died. The wind ceased, the rain stopped, and silence fell across the land. Carter was left kneeling in the mud, alone, drenched and trembling. The cemetery lay quiet, every grave still, every shadow gone. But he knew the witch was not destroyed. She was waiting, watching. Perhaps she had returned to the earth to rest. Or perhaps she had slipped into the shadows of the night, preparing for the next soul to wander too close. From that night forward, Carter never worked in his fields after dark. He warned the villagers to stay away from the cemetery, no matter how peaceful it seemed. They listened, for they too knew that evil could never be fully buried. Years passed, and the story of Carter's fight with the witch became a tale parents told their children to keep them from straying too far at night. But Carter himself carried the truth. He knew the witch was real. He knew she had not gone. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind rustled through the trees, he swore he could still hear her crying. The land was calm. The village was safe, but deep in the soil of that cursed cemetery, something waited. Something restless. Something hungry, and Carter knew one day it would rise again.